Ladies and gentlemen, the captain has turned on the fasten seatbelt sign. If you haven't already done so, please make sure the volume of this podcast is set perfectly to your listening enjoyment. Please take your seat, whether that's on the treadmill, car, sofa, or bed, and buckle in for the last trip. My name is Jamie Beebe, and I'll be your tour guide, recreating someone's last days in paradise. On behalf of myself and everyone behind the scenes, please enjoy the Last Trip podcast. And because nobody likes a long flight to get to where they want to be, let's prepare for takeoff. Kate Osborne had been living in Bali for a couple of years, building a life, making plans, but preparing quietly to return home. On the night of April 18th, 2003, she went out, telling those around her she might be heading out to a party, but she was never seen again. Her car was later found abandoned at the airport. Her bank accounts went untouched. And despite searches, investigations, and years of theories, no clear answers ever came. It was as if she simply vanished. So what really happened to Kate Osborne? To understand what may have happened to Kate Osborne, you really have to understand Bali itself. And I can say that in a very personal way, because I've been there. I actually stayed in Bali for about a month a couple of years ago. And I completely understand how someone could go there for a short trip and end up staying much longer. There's just something about being there. The weather is that perfect kind of warm and humid where you can live in shorts and a tank top year-round. The people are incredibly kind, and there's this overall feeling of ease that settles in pretty quickly. Now, as a woman traveling alone, it was one of the few places I've ever been where I genuinely felt comfortable. During the day, at night, walking around by myself, it just felt safe. And that's part of what makes Bali so appealing. But at the same time, there's another side to it that I noticed almost immediately. Something I both loved and didn't love. Bali is very much built for tourism, and especially for Instagram tourism. Everything is designed to look incredible. Every location feels curated, almost like a set. And people travel there specifically to capture these perfect, dreamlike moments. You can even hire photographers who will take you around to all the most Instagram-worthy spots and literally follow you all day, capturing your best angles. Now, I did it myself the second time I went, and honestly, I loved it. I was traveling solo, I wanted great photos, and I absolutely got them. But it also made me aware of something. A lot of the experiences there are less about the experience itself and more about the image of it. Like, one of the first things I did after that long flight was book one of Bali's famous flower baths, the kind you see all over Instagram. And yes, it was beautiful. And yes, the photos turned out amazing. But sitting in a bathtub completely packed with flowers wasn't exactly relaxing. The whole time, I found myself wondering how they kept bugs off all those flowers. Or if the bugs were just in there with me and I couldn't see them. It looked absolutely perfect, but it didn't quite feel that way. Then, there was the Bali swing, which, if you've seen photos of Bali, you've definitely seen this. Now, there are actually several swings, so you have to do a little research to find the original one. Now, luckily, the photographer I hired knew exactly where to go. And we got there early, before the lines built up, because by the afternoon, you can be waiting for hours. And part of the experience is renting one of those long flowing dresses that trail behind you while you're swinging through the air. And they are stunning. But they're also rented out to dozens of people a day, in the heat. So again, not exactly the most sanitary situation, but you just kind of accept it for the photo. And that's Bali in a lot of ways. It's incredible, it's beautiful, but it's also a little bit constructed. Even places that felt more spiritual, like the famous gates of heaven, are still very much built around that same idea. I went early in the morning and still waited about 4 hours just to get the photo. Now you get there, you get a number, you sit with everyone else waiting, and when your turn is called, a photographer takes your camera, films you walking up, and gives you about 4 quick poses before it's over. And somehow they make it look like you're walking on water, and they use a mirror under the camera to do that. It's impressive. But again, it's all about the image. Even something like Monkey Forest, which feels more natural, more immersive, is still a place where you have to stay alert. It's this beautiful jungle filled with temples and monkeys everywhere. But there are signs warning you to lock everything down, and they mean it. The monkeys will take anything, your phone, your sunglasses, whatever they can grab. And they will bite if you're not careful. These are not pets. And that's something Bali constantly reminds you of, if you're paying attention. There's beauty, but there's also unpredictability. Now, one of the most meaningful things I did there actually had nothing to do with tourism at all. I went to see a shaman, which at the time just felt like something interesting to try. But it ended up being one of the most memorable parts of my trip. I was 45 at the time, single, no kids, and honestly questioning what my future looked like. When I arrived, they dressed me in traditional clothing, gave me some tea, and then I met the shaman with a translator. There was chanting, rituals with coconut water that I was asked to bring, and then he read the lines on my hand, and even did this process where he colored on paper to see if I had any dark magic inside me. Luckily, and possibly surprising for some of you, I did not. But then he told me that in about a year, I would meet a man from another country, that we would get married, and that we would have 2 children, a boy and a girl. Now, at the time, I laughed it off. Meeting someone from another country felt possible, sure. But having children at the age of 45 or later, 2 of them, now that just didn't seem realistic. So I let it go. Until about a year and a half later, when I met my fiancé. He's from Singapore, and now I'm a stepmom to 2 kids, a boy and a girl. Honestly, the whole thing still kind of gives me goosebumps. And that's Bali. It's magical. It's surreal. It's the kind of place where things feel possible in a way they don't anywhere else. But it can also be kind of a tourist trap if you're not careful. Because what you see on the surface isn't always the full story. And that's where Kate's experience was different. Because she wasn't just visiting. She moved there. She built a life there. She integrated herself into the culture, into the expat community, into the rhythm of the island in a way that goes far beyond what most travelers ever experience. By the early 2000s, Bali had already become a hub for people like her. Artists, surfers, entrepreneurs, wanderers, people who arrived for a short trip and found themselves staying, building something new, creating a life that felt far removed from the pressures of home. And that version of Bali, the one people fall in love with, is very real. But it's only part of the story. Because beneath that surface, there has always been another layer, one that isn't as visible, but is just as present. There are industries that operate quietly in the background, including the drug trade. Indonesia has some of the strictest drug laws in the world, with severe penalties that can include life imprisonment or even the death penalty. And yet, despite those laws, drugs have long existed within certain corners of Bali's nightlife and expat communities, creating a dangerous contradiction. An underground world operating in a place where the consequences are among the harshest anywhere. And for someone like Kate, someone social, connected, and deeply embedded in the community, it would have been almost impossible to completely avoid it. Then, in 2002, everything changed. On October 12th, bombs tore through Bali's Kuta district, killing 202 people, including 27 British tourists, in what became known as the 2002 Bali bombings. And suddenly, that illusion of safety was shattered. For those living there, it wasn't distant, it was personal. The victims were friends, neighbors, familiar faces. The kind of people you might have seen the night before without realizing how quickly everything could change. And Kate was there. In the aftermath, she stepped in to help, working as a translator for international aid agencies, placing herself right in the center of a tragedy that reshaped the island. That moment changed Bali, and it likely changed Kate too. Because while life continued, tourists returned, expats stayed, and the rhythm of the island resumed, something underneath it had shifted. And when you look at Kate's life there, her relationships, her connections, the different worlds she moved through, it becomes impossible to separate the place from what happened to her. Because Bali isn't just where she disappeared, it was part of the story. So, to understand what happened next, you have to understand who Kate was and why she chose Bali. Kate Osborne grew up in a place that felt almost like a storybook, Heads Nook, Cumbria, where daffodils lined the driveway and dogs wandered around the yards. And she was the middle of 3 daughters, raised by her parents, Elizabeth and Patrick, in a home that was full of life, complexity, and love. As a child, Kate was deeply affectionate, someone who didn't like to be alone, who craved connection, who needed closeness. But even then, there was something else inside her too, something restless. Now, as she grew older, that restlessness began to take shape. As a teenager, she would disappear for hours, walking across the fells, riding her pony until after dark, chasing something just beyond the horizon. It wasn't rebellion exactly, but it was curiosity, a sense that the world was bigger than where she was, and that she was meant to find it. And she did. Kate became the kind of person who didn't just travel. She lived inside her journeys. She moved through South America, Southeast Asia, absorbing places, people, and cultures. And when she returned home, she never stayed still for long. At one point, she bought and renovated a camper van for herself, taking off across Europe, building a life on movement, on momentum, on the idea that there was always somewhere else to go. And she was fiercely capable in ways that surprised people. Comfortable with carpentry, plumbing, even car repairs. Practical and self-sufficient, someone who could build things with her hands and fix what was broken. But at the same time, she was also a dreamer, a gifted artist and photographer who made her living through interior design. And she saw beauty everywhere, and she followed it. Kate was, in many ways, a contradiction. She was confident, experienced, and well-traveled. And yet, she could also be trusting to a fault, open in a way that sometimes left her vulnerable. She was sharp, quick-witted, and capable, but also idealistic, believing deeply in the goodness of people, even when they gave her reason not to. And that belief would shape so much of her life. She wanted something simple underneath all of the movement, a settled life, a happy relationship, a family of her own. But those things never quite came together for her. Instead, she found herself drawn again and again to people who didn't always deserve her trust, people she believed she could change or help or save. And by 2001, Kate had found a place that felt like it could finally hold all those contradictions, and that was Bali. She rented a house there, got a Weimaraner puppy, and began building something that looked, from the outside, like a future. And she had worked in London for the interiors company David Hicks, and now she was planning to start her own business exporting Balinese furniture. And she loved everything about the island, the music, the spirituality, the culture. For a while, it felt like she had found where she was meant to be. But even in Bali, life wasn't simple. Kate fell in love, quickly, intensely, with a man named Joseph. Now, to her parents, the relationship came out of nowhere, announced suddenly in a phone call when she said she was actually engaged. But behind the scenes, things were already unraveling. The man she trusted wasn't who he claimed to be. His real name was Jose. He had a wife, he had a history, and he had a drug addiction. But still, Kate stayed. because that was who she was, loving, forgiving, believing that people could change, even when the cost to her was high. The relationship became volatile. There were signs: hospital visits, injuries, arguments overheard by others. But Kate explained them away, softened them, carried them quietly, as many women do. Eventually, the relationship ended, and that was around the same time as the 2002 bombing. And after the heartbreak, after the loss, after everything she had been through, Kate made a decision that she was going home. She began quietly putting her life in Bali in order, preparing to return to England. She arranged paperwork for her beloved dog, even planning to take a job at a quarantine center so she could stay close while he completed the required 6 months of quarantine. The deposit had already been paid. The plan was completely in motion. And for the first time in a long time, it seemed like Kate was choosing something steady, something safe, something certain, and she was going home. Until, suddenly, she wasn't. On the night of April 18th, 2003, there was nothing, at least on the surface, that suggested anything was about to go wrong. No sense of urgency, no visible disruption, no moment that stood out as different from any other evening. Inside her home, the night unfolded in a way that felt entirely ordinary, almost forgettable. The kind of evening that only becomes significant in hindsight, when every small detail is revisited and re-examined. Her maid would later recall how normal everything seemed, how Kate was simply getting ready to go out, dressed for a party, carrying the same warmth and energy that people remembered about her, without any indication that this would be the last time anyone would ever see her. She didn't pack a bag, she didn't gather her belongings, she wasn't preparing for travel in any way that would suggest she was planning to leave for more than a few hours. Because as far as anyone could tell, she fully intended to come back home later that night, or at the very latest, the next morning. So sometime between 10:30 and 11 p.m., she walked out the door. But from that moment on, Kate's story changed. Now, at first, her absence didn't immediately raise alarm, because Bali is the kind of place where nights often turn into mornings and plans change without explanation. It isn't unusual for someone to stay out longer than expected or lose track of time. But when Kate didn't return the next day, and then didn't return the day after that, something subtle began to shift. A quiet unease settling into the spaces where normal explanations used to exist. Her phone rang, but no one answered. Again and again, calls went straight to voicemail. Each unanswered attempt creating a growing sense that something wasn't just delayed, it was wrong. At first, there were still reasons to explain it away, because Kate had mentioned before that her phone wasn't always reliable. She wasn't someone who checked in constantly. And when she last spoke to her parents on April 8th, just 10 days earlier, she had sounded completely like herself, happy, steady, and fully present in her life, with nothing in her voice to suggest that anything was about to change. But as the days passed, those explanations became harder to hold on to. It was nearly 6 days later when concern turned into something undeniable, something that couldn't be rationalized or dismissed, because the dog food ran out, and her puppy, Maisie, had been left alone, waiting in a house that no one returned to. And that detail mattered more than anything else, because Kate would never have left Maisie. And then, just as the worry was beginning to settle into something deeper, the first real clue emerged. But instead of providing clarity, it only deepened the mystery. On April 26th, 8 days after Kate was last seen, her rental car was discovered in the parking lot at Bali's airport, sitting there like it had simply been left behind. And when the records were checked, there was only one timestamp, an entry ticket dated April 21st, 3 days after the night she disappeared. That single detail opened up a gap in the timeline that no one could fill. because it meant that sometime between the moment she left her home on April 18th and the moment the car entered the airport on April 21st, something had happened. Something no one had seen, no one had documented, and no one was talking about. And the car itself offered no answers, only more questions. Now, if Kate had gone to the airport, where had she gone? And why had she left behind everything that she would normally travel with? Her clothes, her camera, her personal belongings, even her toothbrush, and of course, her puppy. And if she had left Bali, why had her bank account never been touched again? Why had there been no activity, no trace, no sign that she had continued on anywhere at all? Her birthday arrived on May 13th, just weeks later, and passed in complete silence. Without a call, without a message, without even the smallest sign that she was still out there somewhere. Now, for her parents back in England, the silence became something they could feel physically, something that followed them through each day. At first, they held on to hope, imagining that maybe she had traveled somewhere unexpected, that maybe she would call suddenly, casually, as if nothing had happened, explaining it all in a way that made sense. Her mother, Elizabeth, kept calling her phone over and over again, holding on to one small, kind of unsettling detail, that the phone continued to ring. It didn't go dead, it didn't disconnect. It rang long enough to suggest that somewhere, somehow, it was still being charged, which meant someone had it. But no one ever answered. After 3 weeks of no contact, the reality of the situation could no longer be pushed aside. And her parents went to the Foreign Office, setting into motion an international search that would stretch across countries, across systems, and across years. Eventually, they boarded a plane to Bali themselves. But somewhere during that journey, both of them felt the same quiet, devastating certainty settle in. They believed she was gone. And from that moment on, the search was no longer just about finding Kate alive. It became about finding her at all, about understanding what had happened in those missing hours, about bringing her home in whatever way was still possible. But the deeper the investigation went, the less clear everything became. Now, her on-again, off-again boyfriend, whose real name was Jose Henrique, a Peruvian surfer, had also disappeared, leaving behind no clear trace of where he had gone, no explanation for his absence, and no way to confirm his role, if any, in what had happened. Her handbag and passport were missing, but everything else remained behind. The life she had built, the plans she had been preparing for, and the dog she loved, left exactly where she had expected to return to. The investigation was slowed by distance, by jurisdiction, and by a lack of urgency that frustrated her family. British officers pushed for deeper searches and forensic work that never fully materialized, including requests to examine her home more thoroughly, requests that were ultimately denied. Still, her family refused to stop. Elizabeth reached out to anyone she could find in Bali's expat community, chasing leads, following fragments of information, passing everything she learned back to the police, trying to build something out of the pieces that remained. But the pieces never really fit together. There were sightings that led nowhere, rumors that unraveled under scrutiny, and even years later, an informant who claimed to know the truth, but whose story could never be confirmed. And so what remains is a gap, a stretch of time that begins the moment Kate walked out of her home that night and ends with a car sitting quietly in an airport parking lot 3 days later, offering no explanation for how it got there. There are only unanswered questions. Who was she really with that night? What happened in those final hours? And how, in a place filled with people, movement, and life, does someone simply vanish, leaving behind everything, as if they had every intention of coming back and just never did? Kate Osborne was preparing to come home, but somewhere in those final days, something or someone stopped her, and no one has ever been able to explain who or what that was. Now, in a story like this, where there is no clear timeline, no confirmed final sighting, no physical evidence that can anchor the truth to something solid, what's left behind isn't just grief, it's questions. Because the reality is, there isn't just one explanation for what might have happened to Kate Osborne. There are many. And over the years, those possibilities have shifted and reshaped themselves, depending on who you ask, what information surfaces, and which details feel impossible to ignore. Now, some of those theories are grounded in what we know. Others live in silence, in the contradictions, and in the people who were never fully accounted for. And for Kate's parents, those theories don't just exist in the abstract. They come to them in fragments, in tips, and in rumors. Now, at one point, they were told that Jose, or Joseph, the man at the center of so much of Kate's life in Bali, had been seen near the Brazil-Peru border, traveling with two women who were allegedly involved in drug smuggling. And just for a moment, there was a flicker of something dangerous and desperate. What if one of those women was Kate? What if she was still alive, caught in something bigger than anyone had realized? But unfortunately, like so many leads in this case, it went nowhere. It was another dead end. Over time, though, two main theories began to take shape. Two explanations that, despite their differences, both point to the same unsettling conclusion: foul play. Now, the first theory places her directly in the path of the drug world that existed just beneath the surface of Bali at the time. Because Kate wasn't completely removed from it. In fact, she may have known more than she should have. There are reports that she had threatened to go to Interpol with the names of individuals involved in drug activity on the island. Something that, in a place like Bali, where drug convictions can carry the most severe consequences, would have made her a serious liability. Now, in 2002, she had reportedly been in contact with the FBI, sharing what she knew about drug operations on the island, and providing names of people she believed were involved. Now, if that's true, it places her in a position that is incredibly dangerous, not just as a participant, but as someone who knew too much, someone who had crossed an invisible line. And in that version of events, her disappearance begins to look less like a mystery and more like a silencing, a deliberate act. But then there's the second theory, and in some ways, this feels even more personal. Because it doesn't begin with an underground network or a broader criminal world. It begins with relationships and jealousy. At the center of this theory is Kate's boyfriend. Now, even though he was not believed to be in Bali at the exact time of Kate's disappearance, and even though he later denied any involvement, claiming from prison that he believed she might still be alive somewhere, even suggesting she could be hiding and allowing suspicion to fall on him, his presence lingers over every version of what happened because of the life he was living, because of the people he was connected to, and because of the relationships that surrounded him. Now, according to this next theory, the focus shifts to a married Swedish woman who is allegedly having an affair with him, a woman who, in Kate's life, was not just a peripheral figure, but someone she confronted directly. Kate, who could be both brave and deeply trusting, reportedly approached her and threatened to expose her husband, a man said to be connected to drug trafficking, to the authorities. That moment, if it happened the way it's been described, may have been the point where everything changed. Because what Kate may not have fully understood was the level of danger she was stepping into. Now, in this version of events, she wasn't just a witness or an outsider. She became a problem, a liability, someone who needed to be dealt with. And there is a belief, held by some investigators and by those closest to the case, that this woman may have arranged for Kate to be killed, and that her body was disposed of at sea, erased in a way that would leave no trace, no evidence, and no possibility of recovery. And this is a theory that is both specific and devastating. And yet, even with years of investigation, even with the involvement of British authorities, there has never been enough evidence to formally charge anyone. No definitive proof, no resolution. And that's where this case remains suspended. Because both of these explanations, different as they are, share something in common. They suggest that Kate didn't just vanish. There was no accident. She didn't start a new life, but that she crossed paths with something or someone that changed the course of her life in a way she couldn't come back from. And perhaps the most unsettling part of all this is that both theories rely on the same truth about Kate: that she was brave, that she was compassionate, that she believed in people, sometimes more than they deserved. And that belief is what may have put her in danger. And decades later, the questions still remain. Not just what happened to Kate Osborne, but who knew and never told. Now, there's a version of Bali that people fall in love with almost instantly. It's the version where life feels softer, slower, more intentional. The one where you wake up to sunlight and incense, where the cost of living feels manageable, where you can build something new for yourself without the weight of everything you left behind. And for many people, especially expats, that version is real. But it's just not the whole picture. Because living in Bali, really living there, not just passing through as a tourist, means navigating a completely different system, one that operates under different laws, different expectations, and different risks than what many travelers are used to. And sometimes those differences aren't obvious until it's too late. Now, one of the most serious and often misunderstood realities of life in Indonesia is its approach to drugs. Possession, distribution, or even association with drug activity can lead to long prison sentences and, in some cases, the death penalty. And this isn't theoretical. It has happened repeatedly, including to foreign nationals who underestimated the severity of the laws or believed they wouldn't be applied to them. Because there's no leniency for being a tourist, and there's no protection for being an expat. Even if you're associated with the wrong people, if you're in the wrong place at the wrong time, the consequences are immediate and severe. And navigating the legal system as a foreigner can be overwhelming, isolating, and in some cases, life-altering. And that's where another layer of risk comes in. Because being an expat often means living without the same support systems you would have at home. You don't have immediate access to family. You may not fully understand the legal system. And you might rely on a smaller circle of people, friends, partners, acquaintances, who become your entire world. And sometimes that world can become unsafe. Now, relationships, especially intense ones formed quickly in expat environments, can escalate in ways that feel hard to recognize at first. There's a closeness that develops fast when you're far from home, a reliance on one another that can blur boundaries, making it harder to see when something shifts from connection into control. And if that relationship becomes abusive, the situation can feel even more complicated. Because leaving isn't just about walking away. It can mean figuring out where to go in a foreign country. It can mean navigating visas, housing, finances, and language barriers. It can mean fearing that you won't be believed, or that the system won't protect you the way it might at home. And so people stay longer than they should. They explain things away. They minimize what's happening. They try to fix it until leaving feels almost impossible. Now, if you're living abroad, especially in a place like Bali, there are things that matter a little more than people sometimes realize. Keeping copies of your passport and important documents in a secure but separate location. Maintaining access to your own finances, even if you're in a shared situation. Knowing where your embassy or consulate is and how to contact them in a case of emergency. Building connections outside of just one person, so your entire life isn't dependent on a single relationship. And most importantly, trusting your instincts. Because if something feels off, it usually is. Now, if someone is isolating you, controlling your movements, monitoring your communication, or making you feel unsafe, those are not cultural differences. Those are warning signs, and there are ways out. Embassies can assist in emergency situations. Local and international organizations exist to help victims of abuse. Even in a foreign country, you are not without options, even if it feels that way in the moment. But leaving requires recognizing the danger first, and that can be the hardest part. Because places like Bali are built on the idea of escape, of freedom, of reinvention, of a life that feels better than the one you left behind. And sometimes that makes it harder to see when something inside that new life isn't right. So the reality of travel, and especially long-term travel, is this. Paradise doesn't make you immune to risk. Being far from home doesn't protect you. It can actually make you more vulnerable, especially if you're navigating unfamiliar systems, trusting people you don't fully know, or stepping into environments where the rules are very different from what you're used to. And if you find yourself in a situation that is difficult to leave or get away from, ask for help. Reach out to the authorities, family, friends, anyone who will listen. There are always more people out there who can help you than you realize. And remember, sometimes the most important thing you can take with you when you travel is the ability to recognize when it's time to leave. In the end, this is where Kate's story comes to rest. Not in answers, not in certainty, not in resolution, but in something much quieter, much harder, and much more human. Because after years of searching, after following leads that went nowhere, after holding on to hope in all the ways that hope can exist, Kate Osborne's family has come to understand something that no family ever truly prepares for, and something that no amount of time ever makes easy. Elizabeth has spoken about the realization that they may never find Kate's body, and how, in a way that is both heartbreaking and deeply human, she has had to learn to let that part go. Not because it doesn't matter, but because holding on to that one unanswered question forever can keep you suspended in a place where healing feels just out of reach. And so, instead, she holds on to something else. She holds on to the years they had together, the memories that exist untouched by what came later. The version of Kate that lived and laughed and moved through the world long before the story ever became defined by her disappearance. Because no matter what happened, no matter what answers may never come, no one can take that away. No one can erase the way Kate made people feel, or the way she carried warmth and curiosity into every space she entered, or the life she built across continents, driven by a sense of wonder and possibility that so many people spend their lives searching for. Because Kate Osborne is not just a missing person, not just an unsolved mystery, but a person who lived fully, who loved deeply, and who trusted openly, and whose story still matters, even without an ending that makes sense. If you were in Bali in April of 2003, if you remember anything at all, no matter how small it may seem, no matter how much time has passed, you could be holding a piece of this story that no one else has been able to find. Because sometimes it only takes one detail, one memory, one moment, one connection to bring something hidden back into the light. And if you'd like to know more about who Kate was beyond this mystery, her mother, Elizabeth Osborne, wrote a book called Remember to Smile, a tribute that captures not the way Kate disappeared, but the life she lived, the person she was, and the joy she brought to the people around her. And that's the most important thing to carry forward. Because what stays with us, in the end, is not just how someone was lost, but who they were. And finally, remember to leave a review and rate this podcast 5 stars if you like the show, or hell, even if you don't. But either way, feel free to let me know what you think. Please follow The Last Trip on Instagram at The Last Trip Crime Pod, and subscribe on Patreon to support the show. You'll get extra research, videos, photos, and updates, and even learn more about my personal travels. That's patreon.com/thelasttrippodcast. I'm Jamie Beebe, bringing you your last trip and signing off until the next one. Thanks for listening.